I know you guys are eager to get to some of the CodeNEXT questions. Before we do, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the resources that ABoR has created up here to help educate you and our members. It's a fully branded website. It's got information, videos, conversation guides so that you can become more familiar on this topic, and we've got a quick video to play for you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy Everhart. I'm the Director of Public Affairs here. After a lot of feedback from our members and sort of cries out for help on understanding CodeNEXT, we created this website, and on it is a lot of information you can use and videos and our positions and all sorts of things. So it's you can find it at abor.com/CodeNEXT. And so this is just, I'm just sort of running through what it looks like. And then I'd like to play one of the videos. So the videos came out of us getting questions from members. And so this is how we set these up. So I'm just going to play one real quick.
Hi, my name is Glenn Moss, and I'd like to know what is CodeNEXT and what does it do exactly?
CodeNEXT is the City of Austin's project name for the rewrite of our Land Development Code. Our Land Development Code stipulates the zoning for our entire community. It tells us what we can build and where. It tells us what kind of commercial areas exist, where residential areas exist, what types of housing can be built there. Essentially, it's the blueprint for our community. CodeNEXT has the important job of ensuring that we're prepared for the growth that we're going to continue to experience in Central Texas and in Austin proper. If you want to learn more about CodeNEXT and continue to be involved in this process, keep visiting this website and ensure that you're staying up to date on the most important actions associated with the CodeNEXT project.
Okay, so we've got a couple of videos here where Emily answers questions, and then a couple where Andre, our policy expert, answers questions. He's right over here. And these are all videos that you can share with clients who are wondering about CodeNEXT and all that stuff. So I hope you find it a good resource.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. So again, the website is abor.com/CodeNEXT. So feel free to go to that website and share it with your neighbors and your clients and your friends. Of course, you can always email them at ABoR, codenext@abor.com. If you have something, a quick question, they'll be glad to answer it for you. Next on the agenda, we are fortunate to be joined by Austin City Council member Jimmy Flanagan this morning. He's always taken a strong interest in city planning and property rights. Councilmember Flanagan brought fresh energy to the council since being elected to represent District 6 in Northwest Austin in 2016. He has since become a leader on many issues that intersect with CodeNEXT, and we're lucky to have him join us here today to share his perspective on how the process is going to work with the city and what to expect over the next coming months, and especially how realtors can be engaged to make your voices heard. So, Jimmy, please welcome to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to be here today. I find the CodeNEXT topic to be fascinating. I really enjoy working on it. I don't know that everyone in the community agrees with me on that. But I have a kind of a special place in the process. Councilmember Alter and I both, having come to the council, the latest of everyone who's up there now, there were many decisions made about the process that predates my tenure on the council. Some that I would not have agreed with, that I think have led to some of the weird complexities that we see. But nonetheless, I made a very clear promise to my constituents that even District 6, which is the far northwest part of town, half Williamson County, we can take a leadership position on the future of Austin. Because we are all Austinites. No matter what part of town you live in, we're still Austinites, and we have a role to play in ensuring the future. What's been fascinating about working on this over the last year and a half is how there are so many different understandings of fact. That's probably the most gentle way to put it. It's a complicated thing. I feel like the missing headline in the paper is council does complicated thing, comma, things get complicated. It really is. I don't think it should have been a surprise to anybody. And if you think about how CodeNEXT has evolved, you know, that kind of first major action after Imagine Austin, and then we completely changed our form of government. There's no way that could go wrong. There's no way that could get confusing or complicated. And so now we have a council, most of us who were not involved in those initial conversations, trying to deal with what we were handed by those old at-large council decisions, which I think many of us might have taken a different tack had we been on the council in those days. So I think it's important to note that it can look really confusing to the community what the council is doing. It can look like we don't know what we're talking about sometimes. And I say we, kind of, not me, but others. But it can look like we don't know what we're talking about. But I think what's important to note, normally when you're, in my opinion, when you're watching a kind of an elected body make policy, there's generally a side A and a side B. And it's kind of easy to understand that, kind of yes or no. In CodeNEXT, there's really 3 sides. And that's where it gets very complicated for the community to kind of wrap their heads around. And no side has 6 votes. No side has 6 votes. Roughly speaking, there's kind of the, preservation as affordability folks, and then there's the subsidized housing as affordability folks, and then there's the kind of hybrid, there's a role for the market to play folks. I tend to fall in that third camp. And none of us have that kind of majority clear, here's how we're going to get it done. So it has been complicated, and it's required a lot of really interesting and sometimes awkward conversations amongst council members who are trying to find a way forward. So now where we are here with draft 3 sitting at the Planning Commission and the Zoning Planning Commission and all the other commissions that all raised their hand and said we want to send you a recommendation to, the council is still waiting for our opportunity to vote on things. And that's also been very confusing for the community. There's this weird belief that the council itself made things happen in the drafts 1, 2, and 3. But we didn't. We were never given an opportunity to vote on elements. We don't actually have that role until the very end, which is true on just about everything. And it's a confusing thing for the public. The public thinks, oh, well, the council's involved in every little decision, and every dotted I and crossed T is something that a council member asked for, and it doesn't really work that way. So now we're getting to the end of that process, and that's the part I get excited about. I've seen things in all the drafts that I don't particularly like, certainly in draft 3. If draft 3 was set in stone and unchangeable, it wouldn't pass. It's not ready. But it's also called draft 3. So it should not be a surprise that it's not ready, which has been another confusing thing, I think, for the community. And they see this thing and there's pieces missing, or there were pieces missing, and information's coming out late, and it's a very big document, and things get complicated, right? I think that's part of the theme when you do a thing this big. But I get excited about it because very soon, I hope if there are any planning commissioners in the room, very soon, the Planning Commission is going to send a recommendation to council. Very soon. I don't know if they're in here, but I'm pleased. Very soon. And then finally, council will have its opportunity to get to work. And we've set out kind of a plan for that. We have got our public hearings set. That'll happen at the end of May and the first weekend in June. And then we'll be working towards a first reading by the end of June. Give the community the summer, July. Give really staff July and everyone July. And then to come back in August and dot those I's and cross those T's at the end. Or it could all fall apart. Any of those things are possible. And that is, I think, also a frustrating thing. It has been so many years and so many millions of dollars that there's, I think, an inclination to think that it will fail just because it has taken so much and it doesn't feel like we've made progress to any goal. And we have to resist that belief. What we have now, the code we have now, is broken. I thought we all agreed on that as a community 3 or 4 or 5 years ago when we initiated this process. It seemed to be we all agreed that there were things happening in development. No matter what part of the triad of beliefs you're on, there were things happening that we didn't particularly like. We got to do a new code. We got to figure out how to get there. That narrative has changed somehow. In some cases, we've heard people lament development or demolitions or whatever it is in their own neighborhoods that they're mad about, and then they ascribe that to CodeNEXT. That's happening under the current code. That's why we're trying to fix it. I had a constituent reach out to me, and I must say, if you're a District 6 person, if you're not a District 6 person, I apologize, but I have the greatest constituents. I really do. And I have, often they will reach out to me, and they will have certain thoughts and feelings about CodeNEXT. But what I have found is a fairly universal agreement that we need to have a new code, that we haven't been managing our growth well, we haven't been putting things where we want them to go, that it's too complicated, that it takes too long to get a permit, that all of these things seem to be a fairly universal belief. So to the extent that there's a group of folks who, for some reason, are now saying we can live with the current code, this 30-year-old Frankenstein monster of a code, they are, I think, a very stark minority. I've even had folks who signed the petition, the CodeNEXT petition, reach out to my office and say, we need a new code to do X, Y, Z, so therefore you should stop CodeNEXT. That's what I'm trying to do in CodeNEXT. So there's a lot of confusion and misinformation in the community as well, which is frustrating. And you all have a role to play. You all are experts. You've got to be reaching out, especially to the council member for the district you live in. I get a lot of emails. Every council member gets a lot of emails every day. Inevitably, there'll be something we talk about in a council meeting or a work session, and I get back up to my office, there's 400 emails, all the same subject line, all the same body of text, and sometimes the from email is the organization that set up the email campaign. So I don't particularly value the type of input that seems very coordinated and orchestrated, especially if when you read that email, it doesn't say what district they're in. So there's so much more value to be had in reaching out to your individual council member. You can reach out to the mayor too, but I do not envy the mayor's job trying to manage an entire city's worth of public input. I and the other district council members are very fortunate that we have an opportunity to focus, just as the community told us to do back in 2012 when they voted it in. That's the beauty of the process and the government that we have now. But reaching out to your individual council member is important. Sharing your expertise, sharing anecdotes can be valuable. If you're the type of person that's really digging into the code and you say on page 10 and paragraph 3 and this thing is wrong and it's not going to match with that, share that too. Share it with the board of realtors. There are other organizations that are sharing their input. I know I'm certainly having meetings at City Hall. I know every council member is having meetings at City Hall trying to understand every group's particular concerns. There is still a lot of work left to do, but it is work that we can do. I think we can get there. I am not a pessimist on CodeNEXT. I am an optimist on CodeNEXT. I don't know how you can be a realist on CodeNEXT, but I hope to get there someday. I think maybe being a realist would be great. But right now I think there's a lot of optimism, and I say this a lot. Optimism is a choice. We can choose to be optimistic about how we get to where we want to go through the CodeNEXT process. I'm sure many of you have questions about the petition and the possibility of it going on the ballot. There's some pretty clear state law that you can't put zoning on the ballot, so there's going to be a lot of hand-wringing and teeth gnashing over that idea, but it is pretty straightforward that you can't put zoning on the ballot. It's a state law. It's not even just case law. There's literally Texas government code that says you can't do it. So that, I think, is going to be more of a rhetorical device than a voting exercise. But ultimately, is that not why we have a city council? And in fact, I feel that the whole community conversation in 2012 about moving to 10-1 was about not making decisions solely thinking about how many people could show up to the polls and who they elect, but it is about different areas of town who had varying levels of ballot access and varying levels of numbers of registered voters. And I mean, I'm in 2 counties in my district, and I love my Wilco folks. I live in Williamson County myself. I'm actually the first Williamson County resident to be on the Austin City Council. But I can tell you that the county government in Williamson County has a slightly different perspective on voting than the Travis County government does. So access to early voting locations and those types of things, the ease of becoming a voter deputy registrar, they're different in Williamson County. And so I think there's a very clear mandate from the community from 2012, make these decisions by district. And that's what we're going to do. So I'm very encouraged about where we're going. I hope you all stay encouraged. We need a lot of positive voices. We can get there. You can be a positive voice and say what you'd like to see changed. Because at the end of the day, we have to do this. We have to do this. Every city in the nation does this. Every 20, 30, 40 years, they rewrite their land use code because conditions change, the economy changes, your city changes. New people live here. People who have the same right to vote that people who've lived here for a long time have. And we have to be prepared to do that. And if we don't, then 30 years from now, we'll be where we are today in the same fight, complaining about the next thing, doing the thing that the current thing is doing. And we don't want to be there either. So I really want to encourage y'all to stay positive, to work through the issues, think about what you would like to see, and most importantly, reach out to your own council member. Let them know you're paying attention, that you're paying attention now, that you'll pay attention when they're on the ballot, in whatever November they're on the ballot. Because the one thing that may not be true in the future, every person on the city council is going to have to go up for re-election. There's nobody term limited right now. So everybody is going to have to think about who are their constituents and who are their supporters the next time the ballot comes up. And I don't know if it's weird to talk about it that way, but I feel like that's how democracy works. That's how you hold your elected officials accountable. And your voices are going to be important. Say we have to do this, say your concerns, and you can do both of those at the same time. And I think that's how we're going to get through this. And it is my belief, and I am pushing very, very hard. First reading in June, second and third reading in August. Close the book on it and let the staff start working through the rules process and all those other things. Because even if we pass this thing in August, it doesn't actually come into effect until May or June of next year. So there is a long runway. And even then, we can make tweaks and changes if we find things later. It is not the crazy nonsense thing people are making it out to be. It is complicated, yes, but a lot of things we do at city government are complicated. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. In fact, it means we absolutely have to do it. And I'm excited to be a part of a 10-1 council that has been given the opportunity to fix the problems that the old at-large system failed to solve. And that, I think, is an important thing to note. The community said, do this by district. It wasn't working the way it was doing before. And that has given us an opportunity to rethink how this city is going to grow, how it's going to live, and how we're all going to be together in the same community. So thank you all for inviting me today.
Okay, thank you, council member, for all your time and your efforts and all the helping the city of Austin with this particular issue. So I appreciate you being here today. Let's give him another hand. I'm actually, I appreciate you guys being here. I'm going to need to take off. I'm going to change clothes and go help the ABoR Foundation remodel a disabled man's house so that he can stay in our wonderful city. So I'm going to leave you today. But before I do, I'm going to introduce to you our new permanent CEO, Emily Chenevere, and she's going to help lead our panel discussion today and help guide us through the CodeNEXT discussion. So thanks again for being engaged and being here. And Emily, welcome.
Good morning. How is everybody? Thank you guys for being here today. I know this is not a light topic for first thing in the morning on a Wednesday, but it's one that's really important to you and your clients, and it's becoming more and more critical as we approach that timeline that Jimmy outlined for us. So thank you for being here. Thank you for watching on Facebook Live, those that were not with us today. And be sure to check out the website and the resources that we're providing you at the Austin Board of Realtors so that you can stay engaged in this issue. I'm going to ask the panelists some questions. We're going to go through kind of some high-level concepts on CodeNEXT, and then we're going to take your questions. So up front, I want to tell you that if you can text all capital Austin Realtors with an S, plural, to 22333, then you can join our conversation, text in some questions, and then those will be brought up to me in a minute. So with that, I'll ask my panelists to come on forward. We've put together a panel of individuals today that are all reflecting a different aspect of this issue. They're deeply engaged in CodeNEXT for different reasons, which is an important kind of concept when you think about how CodeNEXT impacts so many people and so many issues in our community. This is a great example of that, and you'll hear that through their words today. So let me just take a minute to introduce these guys. Francisco Enriquez is co-founder and managing director of Glasshouse Policy. Glasshouse is working directly with a coalition of both business and nonprofit partners across the city of Austin through a partnership called Evolve Austin that the Austin Board of Realtors is also a participant in. They are working hard to improve Austin's affordability, transit accessibility, permitting planning, and we hope for improved environmental outcomes in CodeNEXT as well. Thank you. Nicole Jocelyn is an architect and the executive director of the Austin Community Design and Development Center, which has a number of programs, including the Alley Flat Initiative, which incentivizes homeowners to build accessory dwellings on their property for income qualified families. Some of us think that the Alley Flat conversation ended when we had some policy passed about 1.5 years ago, but at the point at which we decided to overhaul our land use code, we decided to have that conversation again. So we're really excited to have Nicole here, not just to talk about alley flats, but to give us other kind of urban design perspectives on this issue. And lastly, we've got one of our own. Scott Turner is an ABoR member and infill home builder with Riverside Homes, who has been deeply involved in how CodeNEXT impacts residential property in Austin. He's doing what you do on a day-to-day basis. He's also trying to work through the existing code, which can be terrifying at times. You might have a little PTSD from that, doing infill in Austin. But he knows what you do and understands your perspective in this issue as well. So I'm thrilled to have him on the panel. Thank you guys for being here today. I'm going to start with just a 5-minute introduction from each of these panelists. So we'll just start down the line with Francisco. How have you been engaged in the CodeNEXT process, and what has your role been?
Yeah, so I first kind of got engaged through CodeNEXT mainly as a curiosity issue. I think CodeNEXT, to Jimmy's point, is a really, really fascinating topic. The last time we wrote our land development code was in the mid-'80s. And in the 90s, we had a population in Austin of about 500,000 people. And so one of the questions that I wanted to ask and help answer was, how are we going to accommodate the fact that from the 1990s when we were 500,000 people to today when we're close to 1 million people to 2042 when we're 1.5 million people, how are we going to accommodate all those people? And I think that that's the basic question that CodeNEXT tries to answer. So my role at Glasshouse Policy as well as at Evolve Austin has really kind of been both the advocacy side of trying to make a land development code that can accommodate 1.5 million people in 25 years. But also do a lot of the policy background associated with that as well. And so some of the basic questions that we hope to answer with CodeNEXT, ranging from the types of housing we build, the amount of housing that we build, where we build that housing to accommodate basic goals that we have set for ourselves through our comprehensive plan Imagine Austin, such as transit accessibility and walkability and compacting connectedness, reducing sprawl and protecting our environment, are all questions that we can answer with this code. So my role has really been trying to both produce amendments and write policy, as well as advocate for that policy to ensure that whatever we produce at the end of this process that we call CodeNEXT is something that does achieve the basic goals of Imagine Austin and answers our most fundamental question, which is where we're going to house all these people in 25 years.
Great, thank you. Nicole?
So in addition to the Alley Flat Initiative and our work at the Austin Community Design and Development Center, I'm also the chair of the Austin Housing Coalition, which is a coalition of affordable housing providers and advocates. So I started getting involved in CodeNEXT because of the Alley Flat Initiative, because I was interested in what was happening with accessory dwelling units. We've been trying to build ADUs as affordable housing in Austin for over 10 years, and as Emily mentioned, we're now, looking at what possibilities there are in CodeNEXT for more of those housing units to be available. But I've also been looking at the affordable housing sections of the code. So in addition to, we need more housing, we need more places for it to be, but we also need more income restricted housing. We have a high rate of housing cost burden in our city. I think, about 39% of our residents are housing cost burden, which means you're paying more than 30% of your income on your housing. And we need all of the solutions we can get to be able to provide housing for people at all income levels. So, I would say to the comment earlier by Councilmember Flanagan about having 3 different camps about preservation, subsidy, and market, we need one camp that has all of those things together, because there just is not going to be one easy solution to such a complex problem, and we need every piece we can get. So that's why I'm involved.
That's great. And Scott, I think we've got some slides for you. Or you're just speaking. Okay, good. Go for it.
I got involved in this process because, as realtors, we see every day that there's a housing shortage, and the data back that up. I mean, the median price is over $300,000 inside the city limits right now. I think months of supply is less than 3 and has been for 6-7 years, and those stats don't lie. And as it turns out, not only do we get to deal with it on a day-to-day basis, both in terms of construction and in terms of brokerage, but we're not the only city that has these problems. So there's a lot of data that really supports, the need for additional housing and removing some of the barriers that zoning, like CodeNEXT creates today. And that really got me off the fence to see that we weren't alone in that. And to give you an example, the state of California right now is forcing their local municipalities to change their development regulations to encourage the creation of more housing. And, California has the title as perhaps the king of exclusionary zoning, and we all like to share anecdotes about that with our clients from California, but that's a good example of how pervasive the problem is. So it's not really developers versus neighborhoods. It's really a much bigger problem citywide and nationwide that we really have to solve. So that got me off the fence and got me doing a lot of volunteer work for ABoR and the HBA as sort of the residential guy, I guess. So I get to look at the code that applies to really what we do all the time. Single-family homes, duplexes, that's about all there are under the current code for the vast majority of the city, and it's been that way for 30 years. But we need more options right now. Missing middle housing, you probably heard that term. That's sort of everything between apartments on the corridors and single-family homes in the middle of neighborhoods. ADUs, townhomes, row homes, tiny houses, everything you see in a major metropolitan area. None of that's really feasible in our code today, and that needs to change. So that's what I've been working on, is trying to make CodeNEXT something that does accomplish these goals.
Scott, let me stick with you. You started to answer a question I was going to ask you about the current problems with the existing code, aside from the fact that the last time we adopted one was 1983, and a few things have changed in Austin since then. What could we expect from a new code? What's the gap that we're trying to fill between our existing old patchwork code and this new thing that we're looking at?
So I'm glad you mentioned the code change. So the last time the code changed was 35 years ago. And if you look around almost any neighborhood in Austin, wherever you live, wherever you're selling houses, wherever your clients are buying houses, and you see something that you think, hey, that might be an affordable place to rent. Chances are that was built before 1984, and that is not coincidental. The code changed, and with it, all those different housing types went out the door. And unfortunately, those kind of diversity of housing is really what make a lot of our favorite neighborhoods our favorites. Clarksville, Hyde Park, et cetera, have a mix of housing types in there, and that's what gives them diversity and vibrancy, and that is lacking in just neighborhoods full of single-family homes. So we need to focus on, what can we do to encourage different housing types in the new code to get away from the code that we've had for the last 30 years. And to put that in perspective, up until 2 or 3 years ago, when ADUs were allowed citywide and most of central Austin, you could only build a single-family home on most lots. So for 30 years, we really have had no other choice than single-family construction, duplexes here and there if your lot's big enough, but otherwise, we've really been a single-family only city, and that needs to change. So that's what one of our goals out of the code is to get more missing middle housing and then simplify it, as we've all have stories about how difficult it is to get a permit, how long it takes, et cetera. That process needs to be streamlined and not made more complicated as a part of the code.
Right, that's great. Nicole, you talked about capacity overall. I think how many people in this room are feeling the squeeze of not having enough inventory of housing in the city of Austin? All of you? Yeah, and not just in the city of Austin, but in the region, because what happens in Austin impacts all of Central Texas. We just squeeze our problems out to our neighbors all around us, right? And so the city of Austin passed a housing blueprint. They called for a very specific number of housing units. That was 135,000 housing units. This new code should achieve that. But Nicole, how is that going to happen? And is it going to happen?
Yeah, well, so of that 135,000, it also calls for 60,000 of those units to be income restricted, to be affordable for a household 80% median family income or below. And just to put that sort of in perspective, that means that a household at that MFI level would be able to afford a rent of about $1,350 a month, or to buy a house of about $200,020, which is very rare in our city. So, I mean, I think that there are some things in Draft 3 that really help us. The housing blueprint lays out a lot of recommendations about how we can get to that number over the next 10 years, the 60,000 and 135. And some of those recommendations are reducing parking requirements, or being able to build more housing on small lots, smaller units on small lots, which we have in Draft 3. More ADUs across the city that are both attached to the house and detached. We've never really been able to do attached units in Austin, which is recognized across the country as a more affordable way to do accessory dwelling units. So a lot of those things are in Draft 3, but there are things that are missing in Draft 3 that would help a lot more get to that number, and those are things like more housing types, like Scott was mentioning, the missing middle. We've been missing that since 1984, as long as I've been alive. So that's pretty important for our city to really be able to meet the demand in our city for the number of units and the diversity of housing needs in our community. We're not really seeing that in Draft 3 right now. We also need the affordable housing bonuses to work a little bit better. The code right now has an affordable housing bonus program, which is spreading out all of the geographically restricted bonus programs that we have in the city right now. Altogether, the bonus programs that we have currently would account for about 1,500 affordable units as a top limit capacity. In Draft 3, it's raising that to 6,000. But if our blueprint has 60,000 as the goal, we still have a lot more room to go. And we would really like to see for that bonus program to incentivize more affordable units by appropriately matching up the increase in entitlements for development with the affordability requirements in those. So there are a lot of other things that would really help, but those are kind of the highest level things we definitely need Draft 3 to address if we're going to have any hope of reaching our affordable housing needs.
Yeah,
Could I add
you want to hop in
something
there?
to it? Yeah.
Sure.
So last time I checked, and this was a presentation that one of our consultants who's working on CodeNEXT, or excuse me, one of the city's consultants who's working on CodeNEXT produced at the beginning of this process. But under current zoning, we have a housing capacity of about 145,000 units. I think that everyone in this room knows that housing capacity is exactly what it says, which is absolute capacity, which is to say that if we took every single lot and built it to its maximum entitlements across the city, that is what housing capacity is. Again, going back to my previous number, about 500,000 people moving here by 2042, if we say the average household size is 2.2, 2.3 people, we are far below where we need to be in the next 25 years, which, going back to Councilmember Flanagan's point, is why this process is so critical right now. If we don't do something, I mean, Austin's housing supply will be absolutely squeezed to a point. I mean, San Francisco is one bracket of what to not do, and we might even surpass that bracket.
I saw a stat on that the other day. Our average annual appreciation of home prices from 91 to 2016 is about 5.67%. And San Francisco is actually lower than that, if you can believe it. And if we continue on that same trajectory over the next 25 years, just based on that appreciation rate alone, the median home price in the MSA, not just City of Austin, but the whole region, would be over $1.1 million. So we are on the same trajectory as San Francisco in many ways.
Let me break down, too, just a little bit of what Nicole was saying for you guys. A balanced market is one that is stratified, that meets pricing needs and income availability for all of the segments of your marketplace. Right now, you guys don't have housing that meets everybody's needs. You don't have housing that meets most people's needs at the moment. And what Nicole and each of our panelists are really referring to is that this code gives us the opportunity to balance that market again and provide for a more competitive and accessible marketplace for your clients. So with that, I want to dig into some policy wonky stuff with Francisco for a minute. There is the text of the code itself, and then there's the map, the zoning map that applies the text to every property across the City of Austin. All of your clients that have property in the City of Austin received a postcard in the last week or so that told them that their zoning might change. Some people might have freaked out when that happened and they were worried and they called you, and I hope you knew what to do because you looked at ABoR's website. Some people are just throwing those things away because how many of us are paying attention to snail mail these days? But the reality is every piece of property in Austin could be impacted by CodeNEXT and likely will be. What's the difference between the text itself and the map, and how does the text get applied to the zoning map in a way that makes sense to everybody here?
Sure. So the bad news is that it doesn't make sense to everybody, and that's one of the problems with this process.
I'm going to need you to try.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. As Emily mentioned, so there's really two components of how we're rewriting this code. There's the text, which dictates all the different zoning categories that will exist under the new code, as well as the non-zoning aspects like tree regulations and water retention and quality and everything else that impacts how development is done. That's all part of the text. Right now, we're under draft 3. That text is 1,500 pages long and divided into 13 or 14 chapters. And so it's really, really dense, and it's virtually unreadable. On the other side of the equation, you have the map. And the map is basically how we apply that text to the city, which is to say that we have, once we establish all our different zoning types, residential, multifamily, mixed use, downtown zoning types, we then apply those parcel by parcel to the map to determine what the city will look like over the next 30, 40, 50 years as redevelopment occurs. The way that the map has been drawn right now is it's supposed to mirror something that the mayor's really been pushing called the Austin bargain, which is this model by which, as opposed to really upzoning single-family neighborhoods and the interior single-family neighborhoods to having, small-scale apartment complexes or missing middle housing, we instead, at this stage, push most of our zoning, our new upzoning, to the corridors. So backing up a little bit, I don't know how many people in this room are familiar with a plan that we produced as a city called Imagine Austin, which is our comprehensive plan. It was produced in 2012. It sets kind of the vision for the city from a very, very high level. One of the things that it calls for are the creation of these things that they call corridors, which are basically places where you want to establish transit, high-capacity transit options or anything else to make it easier to get from point A to point B without driving in a car by yourself. So as part of that, one of the issues that has developed throughout this process is the idea that we can push a lot of our density onto those corridors to both encourage transit use, but also to not disrupt single-family neighborhoods. I think the questions that we still need to answer are, well, what do we do with the areas immediately abutting those corridor zones? So if we all agree that we want to have high-density development along our corridors, what does it look like right behind the corridor? And that's what we call a transition zone, which is how do you transition from the corridor into an interior single-family neighborhood in a way that kind of makes sense and that's not just a canyon drop-off. So maybe stepping down from high-density development to medium to low-density development in the form of this transition, which would look like small-scale apartments and missing middle.
Think about why that matters. If you've got giant high-rise, very high-density projects along Burnett, for instance, and then I've got Crestview right behind it, I want there to be a stair step. I don't want a giant high-rise next to that cute little home that you guys are trying to sell, right? So it's important from a market perspective that the transition zones adequately transition from high density to traditional single family, but it's also important from a capacity perspective because that missing middle density is an inexpensive product to build. It is less expensive to build that than it is to build a very high density apartment complex, which means we can squeeze out some more market rate capacity that would be affordable to your everyday client. And then it's just important from an aesthetics perspective too, that we've not got these really awkward valleys of high density and then the neighborhood that used to be there behind it. So this is, from your perspective, I feel like those transition zones are the money spot and are something really critical to ensuring the stability of our marketplace. So we've talked a lot about the new capacity. We've talked a lot about the houses that we need, but Scott, I want to ask you about what happens to the ones that exist today. With this code and the potential changes in it, how will it impact a homeowner's ability to make improvements to their lot, to build an alley flat, for instance? How can they leverage their property differently with a new code?
So I think that to start off, as of now in version 3, which again is not the final version, but as of now, there's a little bit of one step forward, one step back. So for example, if you want to make an addition to your house over 300 square feet in CodeNEXT today, there is a requirement for an engineer to sign off on the drainage on your addition And that letter from an engineer would cost about $5,000 or so by our estimate. And that's baked in. Last year there were 5,100 or so permits that fit this criteria. And that's just a huge amount of money. That's like $40 million in expense that gets layered on. So that's one of the things that we're fighting against, is to try and reduce the cost of construction, not raise it, and raise the regulatory burden at the same time. So in some senses, there are some increased costs there and increased complexity. But in other areas, it's improved. And as you mentioned, Nicole, ADUs are easier to build now. So an ADU is an accessory dwelling unit, garage apartment, et cetera. And right now, they're available citywide. You can build an ADU on most, certainly central Austin lots, unless you have deed restrictions otherwise. But they're very heavily prescripted, and they really want to make that easier for folks to build an ADU so you can age in place, so a family member can live on the property, so you can rent it out for a little income. Maybe you rent the front house out and move into the ADU behind, and under the current code, that's still fairly difficult and expensive. And to put that in perspective, today, if you want to add an ADU to your property, you've got to get a separate water meter from Austin Water, and that costs between $22,000 and $25,000. And that doesn't matter whether your lot costs $50,000 or $500,000. You're paying the same $25,000 to add your one ADU. And that is a real obstacle to affordability. That's a big barrier to somebody building a house that median income can afford. So some of these things are happening today and need to change. Some of these things aren't related to zoning, but still impact our ability to create housing. And that's really why CodeNEXT is complicated, right? There's all these different elements that go into building a house or building an ADU that don't just tie into whether or not you're allowed to under the zoning. And that's something we've been working hard on, trying to streamline that. Other areas that have improved in CodeNEXT are duplexes. It's easier to build. I don't know how many of y'all have ever sold any duplex to condos where you sort of buy half a duplex, so to speak. The rules for building those duplexes are very prescriptive. Your walls have to be in certain places and so on. And they're really trying to relax that so that it's easier to build duplexes and add units and add capacity everywhere in town.
Right. So this conversation is give and take, right? And what I would want this group to know is if I take you back to what Councilmember Flanagan shared, he made it clear that not everybody wins in this conversation. There's no black or white perfect solution to overhauling a land development code.
That's right.
I don't think any city has done that. But what we know is that we have to have something better than what we have today, right? We all agree there.
Yes.
And that's what's really interesting is that everybody lines up in agreement around needing something better, but Austin has this way of wanting perfection in a way that is just not attainable. So I encourage you guys, hear the differences, understand that there's good and bad in draft 3, and that it's not going to be perfect when we get there, but that the real call is that we do get there, and that we close the chapter on this project, and that we move forward with something that is more sustainable from a foundational perspective so that we can continue to squeeze out more of what we need on a go-forward basis. Okay, so Nicole, you work with activists. You're deeply engaged with housing activists, whom I love and know, many of them. And so how are you telling them to engage, and how would you tell our membership to get engaged in this process? It looks a little scary and very complicated from the outside looking in.
It's complicated from the inside also. I mean, our members of the Housing Coalition are very involved and really keeping an eye on what this means for how many market rate units we'll be able to get over time and how many of those would be income restricted. So, I mean, we're all looking at how it's impacting the type of work that we do in the city to try to bring more affordable housing. We're also looking at how it's going to impact relieving the pressure of housing across the city at every income level. But I would also, we also talk a lot about how even if CodeNEXT were perfect, if we passed the most perfect land development code this fall, it still would not solve all of our problems. The land development code is only one tool that we need to get right in order to address all of the other challenges our residents face. So we need to push on CodeNEXT and get it to be as good as we can get it, but we can't stop there. We need other policies and resources to be able to help people stay in place, to preserve the affordable housing that we have now, and to have more land and resources going towards building that housing in more places for more people. So that those are things like more helpful policies for people to stay in place. It's things like the affordable housing bond that we'll hopefully be voting on in November, and you know, there are just a lot of tools that we need, and we need every single one of them to be working together. We can't just stop with the land development code.
Great. Francisco, help us get into the politics of this a little bit, which is always a sketchy place to be. But in CodeNEXT, it seems like there are lots of people that oppose it and a few that understand why we need it. But how could colleagues of ours, like the Real Estate Council of Austin, think that this is not good enough? What are they saying, and why are they saying that?
Yeah, so I think it has to do with what I mentioned earlier, which is what we have right now is a really long and complex document that, to Scott's point, is kind of 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, and I think that's really intimidating to folks. I think the politics are really, you know, and people may be surprised to hear this, but I think they're really in our favor right now within the Planning Commission and City Council. So stepping back a little bit, the way that this process will shake out moving forward is Planning Commission, which is, you know, a citizen-driven city-appointed commission, is amending CodeNEXT. And so they are going to be doing a couple of public hearings, one on the 28th of this month, as well as one on Tuesday the 1st, to collect more kind of citizen input from around the city about how this code should improve. And that's one way to definitely get involved as well. They will then amend the code, and I think that a lot of people are intimidated by the fact that there's a lot that we still need to do, and that I think makes some folks pessimistic. I'm not one of those people. I think that there's a really, really good chance that we get something good out of this process that achieves some of our basic goals we established for ourselves. I think that we have a planning commission that's ready to make big changes. I think we have a council that's ready to pass big changes. So in terms of the politics, you know, they're not perfect. Nothing's ever perfect during this process, but I think that we have a really good chance of doing something good. As you know, in terms of our colleagues who are more pessimistic about this, I think that everyone's committed at this point to staying the course of the process to ensure that we get something out of Planning Commission. And then when something comes out of Planning Commission, we can evaluate about whether or not what we can achieve at council is really doable, but I'm optimistic.
Right. So Scott, if the draft 3 is just a draft and the Planning Commission is really the group that takes us forward in terms of presenting something for council approval, what are you working on with Planning Commission? What's most important to you and critical in getting it right?
Really, there's a lot of education because it's such a complex document. Planning commissioners are people too. They actually have day jobs in addition to their work on the Planning Commission. It's a very thankless job in many ways because they were up there till almost midnight last night, I think, talking about neighborhood plans, et cetera. Yeah. So they really have a lot of work to do. So what we're really trying to do is educate and provide information for these planning commissioners and council members to make educated decisions. I mean, really, you can't be an expert on everything, and because our coalition is so broad, we really are able to bring a lot to the table and say, hey, don't take our word for it. Here are the numbers, you know, and that's been very effective so far. Right. So in terms of what we need to see from Planning Commission can make policy changes that staff can't. And so staff has written the code all the way through version 3. As Jimmy alluded to, council did not have any way to, you know, edit the code as it went through its iterations. Only staff did. We haven't had a city manager throughout the entire CodeNEXT process, essentially. And what that means is the code, one of the department heads used this analogy, and I thought it was very good. When the code started out, CodeNEXT started rolling, and it's like it's covered in Velcro, and it's picking up code as it goes along. So each version of the code got longer and longer and longer. And bear in mind, the goal here is to simplify. You know, we're trying to make it easier to build housing, not make it more difficult, but that's not really what happened. And part of the reason for that is because staff can't make policy changes, and they sort of like using that as kind of a shield when they're up there talking to council members. I can't make that decision, you have to. And so that's what Planning Commission is going to do. They're going to start making policy decisions that will make some of these changes to the code that we have to see, and they're aware that they need to make those changes, and we have provided them, again, with the information they need to know what to do. But that's what we're looking to see, is to make things simpler. There's going to be a lot of editing. There's going to be hopefully a lot of deletions of things in the code that are obstacles, so that we end up with more potential housing of all types, in every neighborhood, not just in Central Austin. And I really think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to be really clear that no one is proposing a blanket upzoning of Austin. There is a lot of misinformation out there. I'm sure you've seen some of the bulldozer signs. You know, again, as Jimmy alluded to, there's really a lot of projection on CodeNEXT about what's really happening today. And so coming up with a map that works, coming up with a code that complements the map is all an important part, and that's all what Planning Commission will do here in the next month.
Change is hard, especially in Austin, Texas.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so Francisco, we've talked about how the code can allow for increased capacity, how it could allow for subsidized housing opportunity, but explain how that connects to our other major issues in our quality of life issues in Central Texas. How does that impact traffic? How does it mitigate or improve the quality of life in Austin?
Sure.
What else can we expect?
Absolutely. I think that, when I talk to Austinites, the biggest issue that comes up, there are two big issues. One, affordability. We've touched on that. The second is traffic. Traffic is huge. Traffic has a lot of different causes, but one of the primary causes of traffic, at least in Austin, and its worsening state, is our current land development code and our land use patterns. Right now, at last count I think that I saw, we have 85,000 people who come into one part of the city every single day from outside that part of the city, and that's 78701. We really have one activity center where you can kind of work, play, live, what have you, and a lot of people come to it every single day.
Scott wants to be let in on that.
I think I actually have a stat on that, that 29% of Austin's jobs are within a 3-mile radius of downtown, and that's the highest concentration of jobs in any metropolitan city in the country. So we really are very, very centralized in that sense.
A third of all of our jobs are in a 1-mile radius of downtown.
3-mile radius. So 3-mile radius of downtown, something like 29% of our jobs are all located within that 3 miles, and that speaks directly to what you were saying. 85,000 people all come in, and then they all have to go back out.
And they all have to come out, right? And in addition to...
A lot of podcasts.
A lot of books on tape. So in addition to all the other issues that we've been talking about related to housing affordability and sprawl and everything else, one of the things that CodeNEXT is capable of doing is also providing more of these activity centers. And I think it's a well-worn concept that other cities have piloted very successfully, which is that as opposed to having one area that everyone in the metropolitan area comes to for work, we instead scatter those areas throughout the city by having more mixed-use developments around the city in such a way that we can have more activity centers that people can travel to for work, and they can live closer to their jobs that are not necessarily downtown. That is something that's eminently doable and that we are capable of achieving through CodeNEXT, and would dramatically improve traffic outcomes just with that one fell swoop over the course of the next 20 or 30 years through redevelopment. In addition, one of the issues that we've looked at is transit accessibility, which is to say that there's some pretty well-worn best practices around the country about the number of jobs or people you need per acre to really effectively support high-capacity transit options like bus and train. I should note, just in terms of a piece of clarification, we can run bus lines and trains wherever we want to, and they're many times very effective. What we wanted to look at in terms of evaluating transportation outcomes through CodeNEXT is how do we make it such that we develop more economically sustainable transit options throughout the city, which requires people to live along those lines, or else people don't really ride them. And so to that end, one of the things that we've been pushing for is transit supportive density, which is that we know where we want buses and trains to go in the city at some point, maybe trains, but right now buses. For people to get out of their cars and take more effective high-capacity forms of transportation. Now let's zone those areas in such a way that we can have more people and jobs along those lines such that we can better and more effectively support economically transit options, which would also improve traffic. So land use is incredibly important. It's not just a matter of let's put more money into Capital Metro and run more trains everywhere, buses everywhere, but it's also how do we place people effectively to ensure that we're effectively supporting those lines of transit and ensuring that we have diverse activity centers throughout the city so everyone just doesn't have to travel 7-701 every day.
So just effectively planning takes us much, much farther, right? And this code gives us the opportunity to plan for the growth that we've already experienced that happened while our head was in the sand the last few decades, but also the growth that we anticipate on a go-forward basis, right?
Right.
Okay, so you talked a little bit about other cities kind of trying out these practices for us. Who else has overhauled their land use code? Did they do it right, and are we missing something that we should be doing that they did? Any of you hop in on that?
So there have been a couple of cities that I think look and feel a lot like Austin that have recently overhauled their land development codes. Denver and Seattle are really good examples. Both had huge fights similar to ours. Denver adopted a model in terms of rewriting their land development code that was more iterative in nature, where they kind of passed zoning section followed by non-zoning sections and then the map, and it was a very kind of slow, deliberative process. Seattle got into a fight very much like our own, which is that you have a lot of individuals who don't want the city to change, who are very actively fighting individuals who do want a city change to encourage more housing. It worked out in Seattle. I imagine a similar way that it'll work out here, which is that was just kind of a long, drawn-out conversation that resulted in, a hybrid code that will encourage more housing types and more housing throughout the city. But it's hard everywhere. Austin is not alone in that capacity. The one thing I will note is that one thing that we really should strive for is something similar to what Miami did, which is that when Miami rewrote their land development code, I think that their land development code in total is like 200 pages long, which it makes it really, really easy for individual homeowners and small-scale developers to be able to utilize the code effectively for themselves, which if you want to add an addition and you're an individual homeowner, you can easily flip through the code and figure out what the restrictions are in doing so.
Put it in context. Tell them how big draft 3 is.
Yeah, so draft 3 right now is 1,500 pages long.
Miami's very large, and
right.
their code is 200 pages.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to get down to 200 pages, but I do think, to Scott's point, that what we can do is help streamline some of the things that we have in draft 3, like consolidating zoning types and deleting portions of the code that are unnecessary or duplicative, to ensure that it is a little bit more readable.
I think about the complexity versus the simplicity of the code as a liability issue for you guys as practitioners. How often are you asked to interpret what the code says on behalf of a property owner? Many of you, most of you know that you don't go answer those questions outright, and you refer to you be the source of the source, right? But if you could be the source of a source that is much more simple, easier to understand, and gives your clients really direct answers to their questions, that makes you look good. It's easier for them. There's reduced liability in that kind of transaction. There's really inherent value in the simplicity of a code. So even if we don't get all the tools right, and even if we don't get exactly the capacity that we need today, ensuring that it's built on a foundation that is digestible and easily understandable to you and your clients is a really critical path issue. And that's one that ABoR honed in on very early on. We're not experts in development like some of our business colleagues are, but we are experts in what you experience on a day-to-day basis with your clients. So we've really focused on the sustainability and structure of the code and the language that it uses.
That is excellent feedback for your council members. Just tell them we need a simpler code. You have to field questions on a complex code that is inherently unpredictable and difficult and time-consuming. And really, the bigger the project gets, the more difficult and more time-consuming it gets. I think the Grove was a very recent example of a process that I think by the end both sides sort of agreed was broken in many ways. So we need a simpler code and we need a more predictable code. Because otherwise that complexity is just a barrier to the creation of housing. So if I can't get a straight answer about what I can do with the property, then I won't do it. I'll just leave it the way it is. And that's why you see on some of these corridors, you see used car lots that have been there for a long time. And you think, well, why didn't something else go in there? That'd be a good place for something else. And the answer is, it's probably complicated. There's probably a code that keeps it from doing much of anything else, compatibility being one of the keys. We have one of the most stringent compatibility ordinances in the nation. And to tell you what compatibility is adjacency, right? So if I have a single-family home next door to an apartment complex, there has to be a little bit of setback there, two different types of housing or uses. There needs to be a transition in between, and that's what compatibility is designed to bake into the code. And today, our compatibility limits most of our corridors, which are sort of shallow tracks. Again, the used car lots on Burnett Road, good example. South Lamar, same thing. Those tracks really are limited to like 2 stories throughout most of central Austin because they have a single-family home right behind them. Again, that speaks to the transition zones we talked about earlier. You need to have something in between so that you can really unlock the potential on the corridors to create more housing where we need it, where it's good for transportation.
Right. Just as a reminder, if you guys have questions that you want to text in, you can text all caps Austin Realtors to 22333. I've got another one here that Scott could probably answer for us. If CodeNEXT is adopted, which it will be, and then it's not applied until next summer, what happens to projects that are already underway? Very specifically, what happens to projects that are PUDs that have defined description for what will be built?
That's a great question and one that's fresh on everybody's mind, right? What happens next? So we get a code that works, but what happens to my current development? What happens to future development? And what happens in the meantime? So there are really 2 aspects to that. I'll address the PUD first. So PUDs are sort of master plan communities. They exist generally in the suburbs, but there are also some here in the middle of town, and they generally have their own zoning rules. The Mueller development is a great example of a master plan PUD, but almost any community that you see that is a a developed subdivision is probably a PUD, and those will not change. So CodeNEXT is not changing the agreed upon zonings on some of these master plan communities. But if you're wondering, well, do I develop under CodeNEXT or do I develop under the current code? If you were to ask me that question today on version 3, which is the current version we're on, has not been amended by Planning Commission yet, I would say go with the existing code because it is simpler. And that hurts, exactly. I wish I wasn't saying that right now. Considering how much effort has gone into the code to date, I shouldn't have to say that, but that's a fact. But what will happen, and this has not been finalized, but my understanding is that what will happen is you will get a choice. There will be a window during which, it's probably 6 months to a year, during which you can choose to go under the old code or the new code. And that gives everybody, that's how they've done it in other cities. So everybody will get a chance to choose whether they want to develop under the old code or new up to a certain point.
Okay, great. Hey, Nicole, people have talked about ADUs as an opportunity for affordability. How much are they going to come into play in the new code, and how much of an opportunity for increased affordability are they?
Well, ADUs that are attached to the existing house are a lot of times cheaper to build and a lot easier to manage. In draft 3, we're seeing a lot more opportunity for both attached and detached ADUs. And they're affordable to a point. One of the program that we run, the Alley Flat Initiative, we help people access subsidies from the city that waive their development fees. They access professional services through our organization for planning and architecture to reduce the cost of building those things. So we would like to see more of those incentives provided from the city. I've actually been working with Scott on trying to provide a affordable housing bonus for accessory dwelling units specifically, to where maybe you could get one more ADU on the property that's a little bit smaller that would be income restricted for a certain period of time. So there are things in the code right now that are going to make it easier and less expensive to build these kinds of units, but there are more things that we could do to make it easier and more affordable down the road for more household types.
Great. We're going to wrap up with our panel. Each of you get to answer a final question. I was supposed to ask you to give me your elevator pitch, but instead I want you to tell me what those guys should be saying to their clients. What is their elevator pitch for why CodeNEXT matters to their clients? Go for it.
Yeah, Austin's a growing city. Again, we're going to see 500,000 people move here or be born here in the next 25 years. We don't have the housing to support all of them. If we want to be a city that's inclusive, that's transit supportive, that is affordable, and that has housing for all types of people, then we need to pass a new code. Right now, our code is extremely restrictive. It restricts both the amount of housing we can build and the types of housing that we can build. We need to open up our city to different and new kinds of development that appeal to new and different people, that is more affordable, that is more sustainable, that is more compact, and is more connected.
Great. Nicole?
I would say that the land development code is complicated and a difficult conversation to have, but it's a super important one. And although it's not going to solve all of our problems, it sets the baseline for what can be built where. And that is a very important baseline to start working from, to add other policies and incentives to get our income, of various income brackets served in our housing market.
So
Scott, what are you telling your people?
Well, I'm glad you avoided the elevator pitch there, because as I've said many times, there's just not an elevator pitch for CodeNEXT as a whole. It's too complicated, it's too broad, it applies to commercial and residential, et cetera, so there's not an easy one-sentence pitch. But what I can say is, I can't say what it should be, but I can say what it shouldn't be, and that is the status quo. So what I would tell my clients is, well, right now the status quo is the problem. Property taxes are rising, excuse me, property values are rising, and that's only going to continue because we have a shortage of housing. And until we make a change, we are going to continue to be, and I hate using this stat, but it's true, a study in 2016 ranked Austin as first in the nation for economic segregation. And that is not a #1 stat we want to go championing as much as we like to say it's the best place to live. We just won that award again, I think, for the second year in a row. Well, you know, if we are not careful, if we continue with the status quo, then Austin is going to be the best place to live only for the wealthy, because those are the only folks who will be able to afford to live here in the city limits if we don't change something.
Great, thank you. As your CEO, I want you guys to know that ABoR is focused on how we position you as the expert in this conversation and also leverage your reach, your sphere of influence to ensure that folks across the community understand the importance and value of the CodeNEXT conversation. These guys have given great examples of why it matters, and I hope that you've got a deeper understanding of that. But you're going to have to keep having this conversation. To aid in that and help you out in the marketplace, we've provided you a conversation guide focused on CodeNEXT with both questions and answers that you can feel free to share with your clients. That is also accessible on the abor.com/CodeNEXT website, so that if you don't want to pick up the paperwork but you want to be able to access it again, it's available to you. I also want to end this with a final call to action. I want to make sure that you heard what Councilmember Flanagan said when he asked you to reach out to your council members. If you don't live in the city of Austin but you work there, this is just as meaningful for you, and you've got clients that do live there that should be commenting on CodeNEXT with their council members. So help them remain engaged just as you would if you were a resident here. I want to acknowledge the hard work of your colleagues, those that serve on the legislative management team, our policy chair of the Smart Growth Policy team that is focused holistically on CodeNEXT and has been for a very long time. John Roschert is serving as the chair of that policy team, and I know if there are any folks in the room that would like to get more deeply engaged on a volunteer level with ABoR on CodeNEXT, that he would be willing to have you and would love to have you around. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for wanting to learn more about this and wanting to understand it. Feel free to reach out to myself or any of the government affairs team members to touch base with them about what you're hearing in the marketplace. If we're not answering a question that you're getting, we need to know that so that we can answer that question for you. So with that, thanks again for being here. We'll look forward to hearing more from you guys. Please be sure to access the website, and you can also send in any questions that you might have to codenext@abor.com, and those will go directly to the government affairs staff if you don't have time to stay back with us today. Thanks very much for being here today.